Hey everyone, welcome to Being Well. I'm Forrest Hanson. If you're new to the show, thanks for listening today. And if you've listened before, welcome back. The anti-productivity movement has been having something of a moment over the last 5 to 10 years. The success of books like Do Nothing and 4,000 Weeks from former podcast guests Celeste Headley and Oliver Burkeman, respectively, suggests that people are searching for a reprieve from relentless work and hustle culture. And it's true, we're tired. It feels like there's always more to do, and the grind of emails and meetings and social posts doesn't seem to make much of a dent. Something needs to change if we're going to get to real productivity, doing that is fulfilling, that supports us in meeting our goals, rather than endlessly checking boxes off our to-do list. Today, I'm joined by someone who has thought a lot about this and who just might know how to help. This is a very special guest, someone whose work I've been following for a long time, Cal Newport. Cal is a computer science professor at Georgetown University and the best-selling author of, I believe, 8 books now, including Deep Work, Rules for Focused Success in a Distracted World, and most recently, Slow Productivity, The Lost Art of Accomplishment Without Burnout. He also has a very successful YouTube channel and hosts the podcast Deep Questions with Cal Newport. So Cal, thanks for doing this. How are you doing?
Hey, Forrest. Thanks for having me on. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
I'm really glad. Yeah, same. And I was so excited when I first encountered your book, because I thought there was such a natural connection to some of the things that we talk about on the podcast. So I was like, oh, okay, I've gotten in here, which is great. We talk all the time about changing the internal models that we have about things, how changing how we think about ourselves can affect how we act out in the world. And I thought it was cool how you were essentially applying that idea to the concept that we're carrying around of productivity and helping people update that inside of their own minds.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic because productivity, especially for what I call knowledge workers, so people who basically work at a computer screen or a desk for a living, is complicated. We assume we know what it means. Oh, productivity, like we hear this term all the time. We know what it means, and then we get our views about it. Either we are very much embracing it or we're very much worried about it and want to push back about it. But when you look deeper at the topic, it's much more nuanced and it's much more interesting. And a lot of what I've been doing recently is really trying to understand, what does productivity actually mean when we're talking about this new type of work, where you have an email inbox, where you're writing in Microsoft Word, where you're attending meetings on Zoom. What does productivity mean? What do we want it to mean? How do we get there? And I think excavating those answers is one of the important movements happening right now, as people are trying to understand work in the 21st century.
One of the problems that I think a lot of people have here, including speaking personally about myself, is just decoupling a sense of busyness, the sense of checking a lot of boxes, kind of like I said in the introduction, versus the feeling of actually accomplishing the things that matter for them, whatever the kind of key indicators are. Like for me, if I'm prepping for a podcast, I know that my key indicators are, I need to read the book of the person who's coming on the show. I need to kind of come up with some basic questions that I'm going to start the conversation with. And then I need to develop enough subject knowledge to be able to say something interesting about whatever it is that we're talking about. Those are kind of my KPIs, if you will, my key performance indicators. But then there's all of this other stuff that it's really easy to get sucked into when you're doing this kind of work, whether it's the social media posts or the scheduling or responding to 5 emails from people about it. And that overhead is something that you've really highlighted as an issue for people.
What I think happened is the following. Way back when, we're talking like 18th century, 17th century, the notion of productivity as a formal economic concept emerges. It emerges in agriculture. In agriculture, it's a very clear definition. How many bushels of wheat or whatever I'm growing am I producing per acre of land under cultivation? It's a clear ratio, output to input. And there's clear cultivation or production systems. Here is how we plant our crops. So you can see we changed the way we planted our crops to that number go up and down. And if the number went up, we said this is a more productive way of doing it. All right, then we get the Industrial Revolution, mills and factories. The same concepts applied very nicely, right? Okay, I have this many paid worker hours in my Model T factory. I can count how many Model Ts we're producing. If we change it from the craft method to the continuous motion assembly line, what happens to this number? Oh, it goes up. It's a more productive way to build cars, right? Hundreds of years of definition of productivity. Then knowledge work comes along. This doesn't work.
Yeah.
Like, as you mentioned, most people in knowledge work are not doing one thing. There's not a number that you measure that either goes up and down. I'm probably working on different things than the person sitting next to me. They're working on different things than the person working next to them. Me right now am working on a different set of things than I will be in 3 months. It's much more multi-role, much more flexible. Also in knowledge work, We don't have well-defined production systems. So it's not like we say, this is the way we do our work. Let's see what happens when we change this. Does it get better or worse? In knowledge work, productivity is personal. So it's up to the individual to figure out how they actually manage their work efforts throughout the day. So that ratio approach to productivity did not apply to knowledge work. This was a real problem because we have to manage something, right? I mean, what are we managing? What does it mean to be productive if we can't look at a ratio and see if the number is going up? What we settled on is what I call pseudoproductivity, which is the use of visible activity as a proxy for useful effort. That's what's causing the problem you're talking about. If visible activity is our really crude metric for, this means at least you're not doing something. The temptation then is, okay, busy is better than less busy. More is better than less. So it is the impulses of pseudo productivity that I think is leading to burnout in knowledge work. It's not that the very concept of getting things done is somehow flawed. It's the particular framework we're using, which is pseudo productivity, doesn't work. It exhausts people. And in an age of high-speed communication and computers, it's becoming a real source of burnout.
So let's contrast that a little bit here with your idea of slower productivity, kind of like you said in the book, similar to the slow food movement or, other various movements that have had the word slow in the name. Like, how do you reframe that in a way that you think is more supportive of people?
So slow productivity says three things. One, you should do fewer things. And what I really mean by that is fewer things at the same time. All right. If you're working on too many things concurrently, the fixed administrative overhead of all these things you're working on, that begins to add up. And when your ratio of overhead to actual execution gets beyond a certain point, you become terribly inefficient. You become burnt out and frustrated. Good work is not produced. So don't work on too many things at the same time. Two, work at a natural pace, right? Humans throughout history, until we got the mills and factories, had huge variations in intensity over different time scales. That's what we're wired to do. When mills and factories came along, we changed that and said, no, you work all out, all day long, all year round. That was very unnatural, right? We had to invent labor regulation. We had to invent labor unions to try to make this unnatural work more tolerable. Then knowledge work came along and we said, well, let's just do what we did in the factories, but without the protections. It's an unnatural way to work, especially for complicated cognitive work. So we should have much more variation of intensity over different timescales. And then three, obsess over quality. If you obsess over the quality of what you produce, suddenly doing fewer things and working at a natural pace becomes obvious because it makes it easier to do good stuff. And as you get better at what you do, you get more leverage to change how you work. So you can much more better actually enforce those first two principles. So you put these three things together. It's a different vision for productivity. It's focused on results, not activity. It's focused on the rhythms of humans and not the rhythms of factories. And it's something I think is going to make people happier and it's going to produce better work for organizations.
The focus of the book, in my reading of it, is on work as primary activity that we do in our lives. The notion of like you have a career, you're following it, we can work in these ways to be more effective inside of it or more productive in terms of producing the things that actually matter. But I actually think this framework applies to essentially everything that we do in life. It applies to how we consider our relationships. It applies to how we consider our hobbies. If you want to get more that matters out of almost anything, I think we can probably follow those three ideas: obsess over quality, do fewer things, and work at a natural pace and get some value out of it. So I think that just the overall framework is helpful for people here. But I also thought it was helpful in the book when you highlighted the kinds of people that you think that this approach can particularly help, which is, again, as you said, knowledge workers and particularly people who have some degree of control over their time or their schedule.
Yeah, I mean, knowledge workers is a key distinction, right? So it's specific to that type of work.
Yeah.
So it's not relevant to service workers. It's not relative to agricultural workers. It's not relative to industrial workers. These are labor contexts that have their own challenges and their own thinkers trying to figure out, how do we make this work more sustainable? How do we make this work more efficient? This is very specifically knowledge work, as that's the topic that I'm particularly interested in. As a technologist, I'm very interested in the impact of technology on different parts of our life. And knowledge work is a place where technology really corrupted what work was in a way that requires these responses. Within knowledge work, however, I think these ideas apply for almost any job. Now, if you're fully autonomous, you run your own knowledge work company, it's a one-person shop, then you have a lot of flexibility to try whatever you want to try. It's easy to try things. If, on the other hand, you work for a boss that works for a boss that's part of a massive corporation, it is harder to put these ideas into practice. But actually, most of the advice in the book is aimed at that scenario, that I cannot just dictate arbitrarily, this is how I work now, don't bother me with this. Most of the advice is, how do you get those three properties, fewer things, natural pace, and obsession over quality? How do you integrate those into your life, even if you have 5 bosses? So I think throughout knowledge work writ large, these ideas help. And throughout most of knowledge work, you can apply these ideas. What varies is how easy it is to apply them.
For me, at least inside of my own life, taking a look around, I could probably benefit by doing these 3 things, do fewer things, natural pace, obsess over quality. I think I've got the obsess over quality part though. Hey, we're all still working on that one. But the first 2, absolutely. And even just facing the model that you've created here, I think can move people a little bit toward considering the ways in which they might have some blocks inside of them to doing those things, whether it's busyness as a kind of anxiety coping mechanism, or it's our tendency to push ourselves to protect ourselves from criticism, whatever might be going on here. So I'm wondering, Cal, for you, was this something that came really naturally to you, or did you have to work on it?
For me, it comes more naturally, but I have a ton of autonomy. Right? I'm a professor and I'm a writer. But what you pointed out there about anxiety is a really important point. And it's one I learned a lot about talking to people about this book. It's easy, from the perspective of just thinking about these topics purely functionally, which I often sometimes do. Like, what's the actual best way to organize labor? Like a good computer scientist, I'll say, what we're doing now with pseudoproductivity is inefficient. Is a suboptimal way to have a distributed system execute. It's more efficient to do this. When I inveigh against email, I argue about the psychological inefficiencies of context switching. This is a bad way to take a human brain and have it actually produce stuff using its neurons. This is suboptimal. It's very engineering.
Totally.
But when I hear from people about pseudoproductivity and slow productivity as a solution, anxiety comes up all the time, right? Because if pseudoproductivity is more or less what your company is saying, here's what we value, there's a psychological safety in leaning into it. It's very predictable. It's very achievable, right? Everyone can achieve pseudo productivity. I just have to get in the middle of things and constantly be monitoring things, and monitor in the evening, monitor it in the weekend, make sure I'm always in the mix of things. It's a goal you'll succeed at. And it's a goal that you're like, this is probably valued in my company because it looks like I'm a team player. When you move towards slow productivity, well, it's no longer so certain that you're automatically going to succeed, because for slow productivity to really pay off and be sustainable, ultimately that final piece has to matter. Ultimately, you have to be producing good stuff.
Yeah.
Right. I am producing high quality stuff. I'm making my own terms about how I do it. That's psychologically scarier, because what if you fail, right? What if you work on fewer things? You're not as visibly busy, and the stuff you produce now is more noticeable and it's not very good. That's scary for a lot of people. There is a lot of comfort in pseudo productivity. It's easy to say this is an inefficient way to work. It's much more better to work this other way. But there is psychological safety in this current way that we work. And we shouldn't overlook the anxiety of shifting from busyness, which I can 100% succeed at, to results, which now I actually have to do the work and it might not work out.
Yeah, for me, there's definitely some busyness as a form of procrastination that can creep in. It's just a lot easier for me to do some kind of light writing for a social post than it is for me to really dig in and find the next significant topic that I want to create content about, or even working through who do I want to invite to have on the podcast, and face the potential rejection that can be associated with people saying no, whatever's going on there. Like, I do think that the kind of psychological, emotional side of it has become much more prominent in the conversations that we have about this stuff over time, for sure. Like in the 80s, it was just kind of not a topic. Or maybe I should say in the 70s, it was just kind of not a topic. And then some people in the 80s started coming along and saying, hey, maybe we should think about this a little bit. But it's still, I think, a bit under discussed in the field.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has changed. You go back in the 70s and read productivity books. I've written about this before. It's talking about a different world.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally.
If you follow business, time management, and productivity books decade by decade, you can witness the evolution of what work was, right? Like in the 70s, you get these productivity time management books that they're very low energy. There's almost like a malaise to them. It's like, here's the system for like prioritizing, we have ABC prioritization, and it's like there's low energy. The country was in sort of like a low energy mood. Then you get from the late 80s to the 90s, you get like high energy, very optimistic productivity. This is the
Sure,
Stephen
sure.
Covey
Yeah.
era, right?
Yeah,
It's like
yeah,
you can
totally. Seven
actually,
habits.
yes, which is all about you can achieve the things you care about in life with the right system, right?
Yeah,
You
some of the
know your
manifesting
roles,
stuff starts coming in around then. Totally.
and that it's a tractable problem. Like
Yeah.
if I know this is important, I'll schedule my big rocks for this in the week, and I'll have this planner, and I'll be a great dad, and I'll be great at my business or whatever.
Hmm.
Then you get to the late 90s, early 2000s, David Allen, you get Getting Things Done. And suddenly productivity takes this like nihilistic dark turn towards we're completely overwhelmed and we're trying to just find some sanity. Like Getting Things Done is a very nihilistic book. It's you are completely overwhelmed by things to do. And what is our goal? The goal of Getting Things Done is not to be a superstar. The goal of
Yeah.
that book is not to achieve your goals. The goal of that book is to achieve brief moments of mental peace.
Mhm.
And the whole book is psychological. The whole book is psychological, is how do you get this stuff out of your mind? How do you reduce work to this almost like dystopian widget cranking, where it's all in your systems. You don't have to stress about it. You're just like, I do this next. I do this. When I'm done, I'm done. That's a major turn from Stephen Covey to David Allen.
Yeah.
And what I argue as a technologist is what happened between those two moments, the front office IT revolution.
I was going to
Computers on
say
the
it's
desk and
convenient
computer
that
networks.
email is when like all of this started happening for people, basically.
And this is my argument from slow productivity is here's the technology argument. If you have pseudo productivity as your standard, visible activity is what matters. And then you put these tools on people's desks that makes the demonstration of visible activity much faster paced and much finer grained. Now it's not, I want to be able to report something at the weekly status meeting, and it becomes, I want to answer this email within 3 minutes. And this is like one of 10 emails I'm going to get on this topic this day. And then you make all of that mobile. Okay, now I have a laptop. I could do this from home. And now I have a smartphone and I could do this from the restaurant. Pseudo productivity plus those low friction technologies is what made this performative busyness spiral out of control. Like it was okay in 1970. You're like, I got to make sure I put the magazine down when the boss walks by and not spend too much time at the water cooler, and I will look busy. When you get to 2020, it's, Slack, Zoom, email. It follows me in my pocket everywhere I go. Pseudo productivity was not compatible with the front office IT revolution. That's why we got the anti-productivity movement, not in the 90s, not in the 80s. We got the anti-productivity movement starting in the 2000s and picking up speed in the 2010s.
So there are kind of two lanes to this that I'm seeing here, Cal, and finesse what I'm thinking as I'm listening to you talk about this. The first lane is I want to accomplish more meaningful stuff. I want to be more successful, whether it's inside of my work life or it's I have a hobby that I care about. I want to practice more effectively. So there's that kind of world of it. I want to get better at being good at stuff. And this is a great way to do that. Second world of it is everything you're describing. There's the technology revolution. There's all of the overhead that we have with all of these various projects. And there's an overall pressure inside of the business world for many people to perform busyness in the way that you're describing, where what we're tracking is not necessarily like how many things are you actually accomplishing, it's how many emails are you sending. And there are these very visible markers of that busyness in exactly the way that you're describing. I'm not sure if you view these as kind of two separate circles, or if this is actually just one big circle and it's all kind of intertwined with each other. And I'm wondering how you think about that.
I do think about it that way. And I think
Okay.
my writing at different scales
Yeah.
goes back and forth between these topics. So for example,
Totally.
if you look at a book like Deep Work,
Yeah.
that's really focused on like you as the individual, how do you do stuff that's valuable?
Yeah.
And it's like, hey, cognitive work depends on focus. Focus is trickier than you think, and you should practice focus and get good at sustaining your concentration. And if you're multitasking, like you're producing at a much lower level, and it's about how do you do what you want to do better. But then you get a book like A World Without Email or the first part of Slow Productivity, that's looking at the other problem. Why are we having such a hard time doing these things we know work that matters for doing stuff that's important? What has happened in the systems where we live that's making this difficult? So it's sort of bouncing back and forth. In Slow Productivity, I put both ideas in the same book. Part one of the book, all right, what is going on with our broken definition of productivity? And I tell the stories we've already talked about on the show so far, pseudo productivity, the tech revolution. Then part two, what should I do
Yeah.
to get away from that and produce stuff that values? So I think you got it absolutely right.
Cool.
Where I think we get tripped up, and I mean we in sort of like the general sense of people who write about this, is focusing on just one of these areas to the exclusion of the other, right? So the anti-productivity movement is very much focused on like, what are we getting wrong? And are very suspicious about the discussion of like, what can you do as an individual? They say, don't distract people talking about what the individual should do because you'll distract people from the big systemic changes we have to
Yeah.
make. But then on the other hand, you have the sort of just hardcore how-to productivity types that are only focusing on your tools and how you get more done. And they're completely ignoring why is it hard for so many people to do this? Like what's going on in their job or what's going on in the tech environment that's making this difficult. Both of these topics are important. And so I think you're absolutely right. We have to integrate both, at least keep bouncing back and forth between both. Because when you just do one without the other, it's just a partial solution.
Yeah, and I'm very sympathetic to the anti-productivity types in general. Like I mentioned, I talked to Oliver Berkman on the show. I think that Oliver's writing is phenomenal. For starters, he is an unbelievably good writer. I wish I could write like Oliver writes. And I just very contemplative guy, very thoughtful about the whole thing. I do think that sometimes in the do nothing of it all, which has appeared as kind of like a major phrase over the last little while, there is something that's missed, which is that people like doing stuff, like feeling effective, feeling good at things, feeling like we're making stuff that matters is actually a enormous psychological resource for most people. One of the major problems with depression as a disorder is that it stops people from doing things. And then
Yeah.
it becomes this self-reinforcing cycle of not doing. So clearly we want to be doing something. The question is like, what containers are we doing it in a way that's actually supportive of the human spirit as opposed to relentlessly grinding us down?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the difference is the frame that the critique is coming from. So like Oliver, who I know and like, and he was just here a couple weeks ago. It's an
Right.
episode with him. He takes a philosophical frame,
Yeah.
like a philosophical psychological frame, which I think is right. So when he's examining our issues with productivity and what a solution might look like, he's thinking a lot about our interior psychological reality, how we think about our life being short, how we think about getting things done, what that means, philosophically, what we should be trying to do in our life. And I think that's very effective. The other frame this movement takes, which I think is less effective, is more of like an economic anti-capitalism frame,
Sure. Yeah.
which I think is just less immediately applicable to most people. So if
Sure.
you come at it from the frame of you're doing things because you have a false consciousness that's been implanted in you by capitalism, and the revolutionary act is to not do things, it's interesting from an academic perspective, but I don't think it's mapping well onto people's experience, right?
Sure, yeah. I'm sympathetic to that as a worldview, but for most people, they can't actually engage in that as a practice without losing their job and having a lot of problems associated with it. Yeah.
And I think it doesn't exactly capture knowledge work right. I've had this argument with this crowd as well, is that I think also too often they're extrapolating anti-capitalism messages that actually come out of either the industrial sector or the service sector, where
Sure.
I think
Yeah.
they're well thought through and a big part of labor activism.
Hmm.
And they're quickly translating them over to knowledge work, where, I've been writing about knowledge work for a couple decades now. And
Yeah.
I think the reality of knowledge work is it's complicated in an interesting and unfortunate way. But like what we were talking about before is I think a lot of the performative busyness, this is less about economic exploitation than it is about pseudoproductivity plus technology being a bad mixture. And the reason being, performative busyness, this thing that we all are pushing back against, is also bad for the companies, right? It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
produce more value. It doesn't make
Yeah.
your software firm more productive. It doesn't make your law firm bill higher hours, right? It's actually not a productive way to work. So it moves away from a zero sum dynamic where the company does better at the expense of your individual mental health getting worse. I think it's a more complicated system. It's different than what you have where you say, we should have higher pay per hour at the Ford plant. It's not as clear cut as that. It's not management versus labor. It's techno social economic systems that have spiraled out of control. The biggest bulwark against improvement in knowledge work is, I think, just complexity, right? Like the way we work in knowledge work with this busyness and the email and the meetings is a terrible way to use human brains to produce value. It reduces the profitability of companies. It makes people miserable. Why don't we change that? Because the alternatives are very hard. and it's hard to get right. It's less risky for a manager just to say, I don't want to rock the boat. So, anyways, this is why I think Oliver is resonating more. His psychological philosophical frame is just correct. I think he's actually putting his finger on how individuals actually, their interior life, how it actually feels.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that I connected with in his work as well. And, I have a background in Buddhism and things like that. So the overall kind of philosophical bent of it definitely connects with my personal worldview, which is always nice when it lines up that way. I think that your overall point here is interesting, which is that this is bad for everybody. No one's winning here. Like there are
Yeah.
no victors outside of course, the like massive, you know, we could do a whole hegemonic economic thing, but we're not going to do that here. I'm not going to get sucked into this, Cal, although I love where
Ah,
we got here because I found it very, very interesting. But I do think it's interesting that like just no one's winning here, but we're established in these kinds of habits and we're established in these kinds of patterns, whether it's at an individual level with the work that we're doing and how are we approaching it? Are we approaching it in a way that gets us more of what we want or not? Or even scaling it all the way up to the kind of like social, big corporate organization level. Are these organizations functioning in a way that both A, supports the mental health of the people working there, which we definitely care about here for a lot of different reasons, not the least of which from like a pure economic perspective is that, hey, it probably helps them do better work so the company gets more, so on and so on.
yeah. I mean, I think a big part of the problem, and I wrote an article about this a few years ago for the New Yorker that was called The Rise and Fall of Getting Things Done. And in that article, what I argued is a unique property of knowledge work is its inherent autonomy. And I use that word, I'm actually quoting that word very specifically. If you go back and look at the history of knowledge work as a major economic sector, it begins mid-century, mid-20th century. The term knowledge work is coined by Peter Drucker in the 1950s, right? That's when large companies that didn't build a physical thing, but just used people's brains to create value, that's when that became a major part of the economic world. That was a complicated development. This is what's different about knowledge work in a factory. You have to give autonomy to the individual to figure out how to do their own work. They know more about what they're doing than their managers. What they're doing is complicated. There's no best way to do it. You can't break it down into a Frederick Winslow Taylor collection of efficient steps. And he was right about that. But it created a unique environment in the history of work where really how the work unfolds is unspecified. When and how do we talk to each other? How do we manage workloads? How much should I be working on at a time? How do we keep track of stuff that needs to be worked on, but we don't want to assign it to an individual person? When and how should we communicate about work? How do we care about things like cognitive context shifts and interruption? None of this is being specified. We said individuals figure out how they want to work on their own. The work environments at these knowledge work firms was just the emergent properties of a lot of people making these individual decisions. It's
Hmm.
in that world of autonomy that you get things like the way we work today. In that
Yeah.
world of autonomy, pseudo productivity can go out of control when you give people these type of tools. In that world of autonomy, it's very hard to fix because we have no culture or examples of at a system-wide level or an organization-wide level saying, we no longer do this. Here is how we do this type of work. This is when and where we keep track of this. We don't do this at all in knowledge work. So that's why we have such a hard time fixing the problem. Whereas if it was an industrial work and the assembly line wasn't working, we would just fix something about the assembly line.
Yeah. Yeah, and part of what you're doing here, which is so high leverage for people, is you're suggesting some ways that we can start to systemize some of these things. You're suggesting some principles that can help guide how we think about things or how we do things, whether it's individually or in the broader context that you're talking about here. And I do want to turn a little bit towards some of the how-to of all of this. I have personally found the context extremely interesting. I love this kind of stuff. I'm also aware of my own tendency where I could talk about this side of it endlessly without ever actually getting into the things that people can do. The do fewer things of it all connects pretty directly to deep work, which is the entry point into your work, I suspect, for many people, maybe most people, which is where you talked a lot about the power of focusing without distraction on, I think that you called it a cognitively demanding task. Would you
Yeah.
mind just expanding that out a little bit for people who might not be familiar with it?
I think the most important metric, if you could track one metric that was going to capture how well you're doing in your job and how exhausted you're going to be, would be if you had some sort of automatic counter that every time you turned your attention from like one topic to another, so like an actual cognitive switch, that counter went up by one. As that counter gets bigger,
Oof.
Your exhaustion goes up. The quality of what you do goes down. Like if I was trying to optimize something as a company owner, reducing that counter for my employees per day would be my number one goal. And the reason is when you switch your cognitive context from one target to another, especially if it's an abstract symbolic topic, not something in your actual sensory landscape, it takes a long time. It's just the way our brains are evolved. Like if there's a noise at this part of the forest, that we can reorient to very quickly. But if it's a complex, abstract, symbolic thing, so I'm changing from this report I'm writing to an email from a colleague about an unrelated conference that's coming up, that can take up to 20 minutes for your mind to completely shift gears, because what happens is you have to inhibit certain semantic networks in your brain. You have to excite other networks in your brain. You have to basically shut down thinking about one thing, activate thinking about another. It's that feeling you get when you start working on you have a long day of working on a hard project. You know how it's hard for the first 10 or 15 minutes, and then you kind of get in the groove? What's happening is it takes 10 or 15 minutes for your mind to completely reorient. Once it's reoriented, then you're able to move much more quickly and efficiently, and the thoughts are there and they're quicker and you feel less resistance. So context shifts, here's the problem. If I'm working on something hard and then I go to check my email inbox, I'm going to initiate one of these context shifts when I see a message about something unrelated that's important. And then when I turn my attention back to that original project, well, I never really finished completely switching my cognitive context to the email issue, but I started and then I wrenched my attention away from that and I go back to the project. So now I'm trying to stop that context shift and return to my original context. But before my brain can completely reorient to the hard thing I'm writing, I check my inbox again and I initiate a different context shift. That state of constantly changing our context is a self-imposed cognitive deficit. By looking at different things throughout our day, it's like artificially reducing your ability to think clearly, and it exhausts us. So the concept of deep work is like, okay, just don't do that, and you're going to feel like you have Einstein's brain.
Yeah,
If
you're
you
going to feel
just
like you got a big
focus,
shiny brain. Absolutely.
you will. It's
Yeah.
like the secret to deep work is not that it makes you smarter, but you're avoiding the thing that makes everyone else dumber. So if you can keep your attention exclusively on what you're looking at, no quick checks, exclusively on what you're looking at, you are going to be less exhausted. You're going to produce much better work. So deep work was just saying, hey, the context matters. Don't switch your context. And by the way, quick checks initiate the same context shift as a longer distraction. So if you have to keep checking your inbox every 5 minutes, if you're in and out on Slack, you cannot do the primary thing you're trying to do at anywhere near your capacity, and you're going to get more exhausted. So it's not really high-end work unless you're doing it with exclusive focus.
That habitual context switching is a huge issue for people. Been a huge issue for me at various times in the past. It was something that I had to really look at as a significant habit that I had and do things around it. If you think about just checking your phone, habitual phone checking is a great example of this, habitual social media checking, whatever it is that somebody is doing. I actually think that you basically don't exist on social media as near as I can tell, Cal. I assume that was a very deliberate choice of yours.
Yeah, I've never had a social media account.
Yeah, there you go. And that's just something that people have to really focus on as a habit. I know that this is not necessarily the focus of your work, but are there things that you've found that can help people with that sort of habitual task switching?
Well, there's two sources of it, and it's important to break them up because they sound similar, but they have different causes, right? So there's what happens when you look at your phone, for example, like check social media, and then there's communication, professional communication, like email and Slack. Both of these are major sources of context shifts, but they have different causes and solutions, right? So when it comes to like looking at your phone, this really is just a habit. Deep work is difficult. Our brain resists, especially that like 10 to 15 minutes before it's completely locked in on what you're working on. It resists it because as far as our brain is concerned, it's a big expenditure of energy and they don't see an obvious reward, right? I'll expend energy to chase after the antelope because there's a reward. We need food and I'm hungry. Our brain doesn't understand that this big expenditure of cognitive energy on this memo is important in the long run because it helps us keep our job, which pays us so we can buy the meat from the supermarket, right? So our mind wants to get away from difficulties. It's easy to build up a habit of when I feel the strain of focus, I look at something that makes me feel better. I look at social media, I look at YouTube. That's just a habit you can break, and you can break that with practice. And I suggest, for example, interval training where you have a timer and you start with small amounts of time, 15 minutes, until that timer goes off. All I'm doing is this hard thing, and you get comfortable with resisting that urge, and then you increase the timer. The other source of distraction is professional communication. This is tougher, and it's something I think people get wrong when they think about the urge to check an email inbox the same way as the urge to check your phone for social media. Because they say, great, you can solve this by just having better habits. Don't batch your email, don't check it all the time. The problem is there's often a very rational reason why you have to check your inbox a lot. It's because you're trying to figure something out with someone that involves back and forth messaging. And it's probably time sensitive. So if I send you an email in the morning that kicks off a conversation about a decision that has to be made by this afternoon, and we're going to have to send, let's say, 10 back or forth messages to receive an answer, I have to keep checking my inbox. Because if I don't see your next message in time to bounce it back to you, for you to bounce it back to me, for me to bounce it back for you until the afternoon, we're not going to reach a decision. So if you're collaborating through unscheduled back and forth messaging, it's very difficult to avoid needing to check communication channels frequently. So there, the solution is you have to find other ways to collaborate that are not based on unscheduled back and forth messaging. So two very similar impacts. Phone, email, similar impact on your ability to focus. The solution to both those is different.
Yeah, I think that's a really good distinction. For me, a few of the other things that really changed how I approached work that came out of the book Deep Work was clarifying my deep work to not deep work ratio is one of the things that you talk about. Like how much time is the optimal amount of time for me to be spending doing deep work in a given week as opposed to not doing deep work? Because there's a lot of, one of the observations you have is that there's plenty of not deep work that is also good and useful work. Like it's not like the only work that matters is deep work. And then scheduling it, like time blocking, using my calendar as a tool. Has been hugely impactful for me. Having like just the first couple of hours of my day be either recording or writing was a big difference maker for me personally.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are the simplest way of getting more deep work into your life is exactly that. Talk about ratios, because if you instead just say deep work's good and other work is pejorative, that's a untenable situation.
Yeah.
Because everything you work on is going to bring with it administrative overhead that's not deep work. And then you have just a fixed overhead of your job. Like invoices have to get sent, the electric bill has to get paid, or the lights go off in the office, right? So that stuff that's not deep work isn't important. So the ratio is the right question. What is the ratio? What should it be? For me, pre-scheduling is absolutely necessary because again, deep work is unnatural and our mind resists it. If you're just waiting until you have a lot of time and nothing else to do and you feel like you're in the mood to do deep work, you're not going to do much deep work. It's like going to the gym, right? Our mind is like, we're going to go
for sure.
expend this energy. It's going to be hard. It's not what I want to do. No one I know who goes to the gym just says like, yeah, I just kind of keep my gym bag with me. And if I just find myself without much to do and in the mood to work out, I go to the gym. No, they're like, I go during my lunch hour, I go. So deep work has to be scheduled. So that works. Ratio works, scheduling works. And then keeping your deep work sessions 100% free of context shifts, that's critical as well. If you have to break it up, 50 minutes, 10-minute email break, 50 minutes, 10-minute email break, do that. But you have to keep these two separate in some sort of intentional way.
That's a huge lever for people. It's one that I'm still refining my approach to and getting better at over time. For me, the email thing is a huge part of it. Like it's just so easy. Even when I'm writing a piece, I'm writing a blog post, I'm prepping for an interview. It's just so easy to go back to your inbox. And it becomes a habit. It's one of those things, something we talk about on the podcast a lot is how coping mechanisms just become problems themselves over time. And that's to an extent what you're describing here. It's like this little pressure release valve, but then over time it becomes its own kind of problem.
Yeah. Well, I would add here, this is where clarity matters. Deep work is separate from anything else. So not mixing these two things together makes a huge difference. Time blocking then matters, right? So if you time block, this 90 minutes, I'm doing deep work, this specific 90 minutes, and then I'm done. It's much easier to not check your inbox than if you just say, this hard task is something I'm working on today, right? So if you're just like, I'm working on writing or prepping for this interview, it's just something I'm doing today. And like at some points, I still have to check my email. Now you have to constantly be having this conversation with yourself. Well, should I check email now? You're like, no, not yet. Let's keep going. 30 seconds later. well, should I check email now? And like, well, not yet, but let's keep going. You're going to eventually lose that battle, right? Because you have to constantly be fighting with yourself. Whereas if you put aside the time in advance, there's only one decision you're committing to. Am I sticking to the schedule or not? I'm working on this for 90 minutes, then I'm checking my email. It's just a binary decision. I made the schedule. It's a smart schedule. Am I someone who sticks to it or not? That's a much easier battle to win than having to just throughout the entire day constantly battle about what about taking a break now? What about taking a break now? That's one of the advantages of time blocking. The other thing that matters is using different locations. Do deep work a different place you do other work so that your brain really makes a distinction. These are two separate places. So that can really make a difference as well.
Yeah, I think this connects to another thing, another concept of yours that I really liked, which is the idea of multi-scale planning, separating your time out into different buckets at different levels of time scale, and then thinking about what you're trying to accomplish inside of each of those scales and letting the smaller buckets or the smaller scales just flow naturally from the larger ones. That's been very impactful for me.
Well, it solves a challenge, which is if you have multiple complicated goals, right, that you're working on that are over time, not just simple deadlines. How do you make sure in the moment that you're making reasonable progress towards those goals? That's very hard to do. Like when
Yeah.
thinking about what do I want to work on next, I can't continually be like, okay, what is my big vision for my career? And then how am I trying to work on that this season and this week? Where am I? You're going to get exhausted. So multi-scale planning was an attempt to connect your biggest vision to what you're doing in the moment in a way that's more natural. And it's just, look, start with the season. What's my plan for the season? You make this plan at the beginning of every season or quarter, right? Like, okay, here's my vision. Here's what I'm working on. I want to finish 5 chapters from my book. I'm learning this new skill. I'm going to add video to my podcast. Like you have these like, what are the big things I'm doing to make progress towards my big picture goals? Then every week you create a weekly plan. When you do that, you can look at that planning for the season. All right, let me remind myself of the big things I'm working on this season. And now let me survey my week and say, which of these do I want to make progress on? And you start thinking through, what am I going to work on for my big picture goals this week? When am I going to fit that? Maybe I should put some of these efforts on my calendar. Maybe I want to move some things around. If I cancel this one crosstown meeting, that whole morning opens up and then I can spend that whole morning working on writing that book chapter. And you sort of figure out at a broad sense how to integrate your big picture goals to your week. Then when you get to the individual day and you're making a plan for your day, you just reference your weekly plan. And your weekly plan, you put some stuff on your calendar for that day. It has some reminders, and you can pretty easily figure out what you're going to do that day. Then when you get to the particular moment, you're just referencing your daily plan, which tells you what you should be doing at that time. So now you've connected that moment to your big picture plans without requiring you to have to do all that thinking moment to moment. That's multi-scale planning.
Yeah. And what's also great about this is that it connects to what we were talking about earlier about different kinds of work anxiety that a person might have. I had a huge habit of just wandering through my day when I first became like full-time self-employed, like full on just doing the podcast, all of that. And associated with that wandering, I felt a lot of work anxiety. Like, am I doing the right thing right now was a constant question for me. And when I started scheduling my time more consistently and really approaching it in this kind of very methodical way that you've mapped out here, 80 to 90% of that work anxiety just went away because I no longer had to ask myself the question, am I doing the right thing? It's in my calendar. I'm doing it. So yeah, I'm doing the right thing. It just really simplifies things.
And something that critics of time blocking and scheduling like this often miss, they think it's going to make your life more stressful. Oh, I'm adding constraints and constraints are successful. But what they miss is when you're scheduling your time intentionally, you really can enjoy your time off. When you have a good plan for your day, you really can lean into your evening because that anxiety is not there. Like I had a good plan. I did the things I was going to do. It's part of a bigger picture vision. And one of the things time blockers like myself do is it allows us to schedule in more breaks. Like I love to choose a day a few weeks out and mark it on my calendar. No meetings, no schedule, right? And then when I get to that day, be like, okay, I have this whole week figured out where I can check in on some things in the morning and like go see a movie. Like that's the type of thing you can do if you can control your schedule. If you don't, yes, you're avoiding the in the moment pain of I have constraints. I have to kind of follow my schedule, but you're never really feeling relief. You're always worried and wondering, what am I missing? Did I do enough work? Maybe I should be working more. So, time blockers are often way more relaxed than people that take a more unstructured approach to their day.
Are there additional tools from either slow productivity or deep work that you've just heard consistently from people where they go like, yeah, that's the stuff that we haven't talked about yet?
Well, first of all, you want to take the ad hoc communication. So the communication that happens with back and forth messaging and move it. There's a couple places you can move it. A big one is office hours, right?
Hmm.
So just have a set time every day, same time each day. Could be a half hour to an hour, and it's protected. And you have your office door open or Zoom turned on or your phone on or all these things, all the above, right? And what you do is if during the day you get some sort of communication from someone that's going to require more than one response, it's not just a question you can answer, but at the beginning of a back and forth conversation, you defer it to office hours. You're like, yeah, 3 o'clock every day. Call me any day you want at 3 and we'll figure this out. And you start deferring back and forth conversations to real time, these like pre-scheduled real time blocks, right?
Hmm.
In the moment, people say like, no, this seems worse because in the moment I could just answer this email and just in a second, and now it's off my plate for now. And that seems much better than having to wait and put aside this time. But what you're saving yourself from with office hours is the 100 inbox checks it takes to support the 10 messages that go back and forth to answer this question. It's much better to wait to 3 and have a 5-minute conversation than it is to check your inbox 100 times throughout the day to have that same conversation asynchronously. So office hours matter. Teams should have docket clearing meetings, a shared document where anything that like needs to be discussed with the team gets written down. And then you have these regular meetings where it's not small talk. It's not just, hey, let's check in and pretend like we're being productive. You methodically go through this list, thing after thing, and figure it out. Okay, you're going to do this. What do you need? You get that to them. Let me write this down. Assigned. Okay, let's just respond right now. What this allows is as things come up that are relevant to the team, instead of just shooting off an email, you add it to this list. And again, you're saving hundreds of inbox checks that are needed to support these ad hoc back and forth conversations. So office hours and docket clearing meetings makes a huge impact on what's happening with your attention. So that's something I've been really evangelizing recently.
That's really cool. And I think it's a good way to approach it. And it's a good way to kind of systemize those interactions that tend to sprawl, which connects to the broader idea you have of like the overhead associated with different kinds of projects, how they all come with natural overhead. What can we do to kind of condense that overhead as much as possible into a manageable bucket? I am wondering, Cal, kind of big picture here, and this might connect to some of the stuff they were talking about in the introduction to the podcast, the first 30 minutes or so, where we really got into it there. Is there anything that you think that people kind of chronically misunderstand or misinterpret about your work?
Oh, there's all sorts of things. All sorts of things.
Probably a long list, yeah.
Well, one, I think some members of the anti-productivity crowd will assume like what I'm espousing is how to do more work.
Yeah.
So I think that's one, which is not. What I'm espousing is how do you do stuff you care about without being miserable? It is as much psychological as it is economic, right? How do you build, we call it on my podcast, the deep life, like a life that's meaningful and intentional, which is going to include you doing things that matter. How do you do things that matter without being exhausted, without being on, email till midnight every night? I think, so that people get wrong. I think another thing people get wrong is that when I talk about deep work, that they think I'm making a moral judgment about work types. And that what I'm arguing is like the only meaningful job would be one in which you're doing deep work all day, right? That's not my argument. I'm not describing a specific job. I'm just giving the psychological argument that if you need to do something cognitively demanding, which most of these jobs to some degree have you do, it's better to give it your complete undistracted focus than the context shift during it, because otherwise it'll take longer and you'll be less happy, right? But I get a lot of critiques that's like, well, in this position, I can't spend 6 hours a day doing deep work. And so I think people are seeing as like somehow I'm making either a moral judgment on work types or laying out an ideal for a job, like a professional literary novelist that just sits there and writes all day. Like this is what everyone should be doing. And it's a much more prosaic argument that I'm making, which is if you're going to do something cognitively demanding, it's much better if you can give it your complete focus than instead taking that same work and spreading out. It's an argument about how to do the things you're already doing, not an argument about what work would be like. But so I do get a lot of feedback. There's an interesting though. I'll tell you this though. There's a critique I did not understand, and then I brought someone on the show to understand it, and now I do. Right? I would get a kind of a common critique of deep work, where the critique was, "But who's watching the kids?" Now I get this a lot. But who's watching the kids when you're doing deep work? And I was confused about this at first. I'm like, well, I'm talking about when you're at the office and you're there, and you have some things that are cognitively demanding, some that don't. Separate them, right? Like, don't try to mix your email in with the focus. It's like, what does this have to do with childcare? I'm talking about like what you're doing when you're at the office, right? And I didn't understand it, right? And so then I brought on a psychologist from Brown, and we were talking about this. And what she explained to me is like, yeah, but it's not literally about that. What this is about, for example, was the frustration that, you're pointing out correctly that giving something full focus produces better results. But for a lot of women in the workplace,
life is just not structured that way.
It's not structured to do that. And it's very frustrating to them because like, I'm super capable. You're pushing a bruise here without realizing it. You're pushing the bruise of something that I know as a woman in the workplace, that if I could do more of this, I would get ahead faster. But I have a harder time doing this than my husband, and therefore my husband gets to get farther ahead in the knowledge work sector because it's much more structured. So like, that was an interesting critique where I was taking it literally. I was like, who's watching your kids? Well, like, you're at the office. I'm just talking about not how many hours you work. And they're like, no, this is about there's like a deeper frustration that people are feeling.
That's
so
really
it was an example of a critique that was actually much deeper, ironically, to use that term, than I realized it was. And then I brought someone on and talked to him. I was like, oh, I get it now.
Yeah, and just expanding it out a little bit, just the notion of essentially a kind of privilege associated with being able to have that kind of undivided focus, whatever the arena is that you're placing it on. If you literally have if you work from home and you have a 2-year-old kid, your deep work sessions might come with some natural interruptions on the basis of, say, every 15 minutes or so. Like, kids are very demanding of that. So I think it's a really interesting. I wouldn't have thought about that, Cal. That's really like well put together by that person. Yeah.
So there's two different modes for giving advice. So it's another thing that I've learned, right? I come at how to from an engineering perspective, which is, how does the system works?
Checks out.
Let's deconstruct it. What's a good way to run this system, right? I'm not a big believer, for example, because again, I have an engineering mindset. I don't feel like when I'm writing to a big audience that I need to establish like a psychological connection, or I don't see it like I would see talking to an individual, right? If I was giving advice to an individual, I'd want to understand your situation. I'd want to establish trust. I'd want to establish a psychological connection, and then tailor my advice to your situation. But when you're writing for a big audience, it's that doesn't work because it's such a broad range of people, and you can't go through and list every caveat, every situation, because there's 50 of them, and for each one you talk about, the other 49 people, it's not relevant. So that's the way I think about advice. I'm like, if I'm giving you advice on running, I'm just going to talk about what's the right way to train for running, what's the best training, like what have we learned from science to be the right way to train. I'm not going to think about some people have more time to run than someone else. However, the way that we talk to individuals is not that way. Like, I wouldn't come in if I know you have a very busy life or you have knee trouble and it's kind of hard for you to run. I'm not going to come in and be like, Forrest, you should, the optimal thing to run is to train an hour a day, and you should do it midday, in the middle of the day when the sun is high. I'm like, well, this would be really weird. It's not taking into account your situation or whatever. So I found there's like this difference between how you give advice to an individual and how you give advice to a lot of people at once. It's different. So if someone is hearing my advice, they're often simulating how an individual interaction.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that's not the way you talk to a person.
Yeah, totally. And that asymmetry is really interesting, that they're consuming it as the person you're talking to, but you're giving it speaking to the crowd. And I don't think that people necessarily understand that intuitively.
And then there's a whole new genre of how-to, which is not the way I was trained to do it, where you do, even in a book, spend a lot of time establishing psychological connection and credibility.
Yeah.
Right. So this, if you've read a how-to book where there's huge amounts of self-deprecation from the author, that's this new genre. That's trying to establish, like, look, I don't think I'm better than you. We have similar problems. When there's a huge amount of second person, You worry about this. You probably have to deal with this. I feel your pain. Like establishing the psychological reality of the problem. That's this new genre of self-help. And I think it's very effective. I think the younger generation, for example, is more psychologically transparent. They're more comfortable with this. So there's also just these interesting divides, right? I'm from an older school. Let's look at this problem. This is how the brain functions. This is a bad way to structure work. It's incompatible with the brain. To the degree that you can put these other ideas together in your life, it's going to make work better. You're smart. Take this manual and figure out how to do it in your life. It's a different way of writing, because it's not trying to establish. So it's interesting. I've been learning about a lot of this. There's a lot of changes going on. There's a evolution. I should say not evolution, but more fracturing of the genre and the different ways people write. It's a fascinating time right now.
A huge question that you have to ask yourself as a content creator is how much preempting criticism do you want to do?
Yeah.
Particularly in the kind of psychological, mental, healthy world that I tend to live in, everyone truly is a snowflake. And I don't mean that as a pejorative term. I mean that as a factual assessment of what they are. Everybody's situation is so different. And so whenever I start giving advice about how to approach your mind, how to approach your psychology, like ways to interact with other people in your life, we talk a lot about communication skills on the podcast. That's gonna be massively affected by your individual context, the kinds of people you're interacting with, who you're talking to, your own personal background, whatever it is. And I do think that there is a place for asking, like, how portable is any of that kind of advice, given how contextual so much of it is? What we found, thankfully, is that there is at least some portability to essentially all of it. There are indeed best practices here. But yeah, the individual component of it is like so huge. And so if you're a listener of this podcast, or if you're a listener of Cal's podcast, probably good to consider that whenever you think about the kind of information that you're receiving, that this is being offered to a general audience, and you might be toward one end of the bell curve. And that's okay. And it makes you an individual, but you just need to be able to apply that filter for yourself, as opposed to, having a lot of criticism for me about it. But
yeah, I mean, I found like 95% of readers are very comfortable. Like the way they read advice is, I'm stripping this car for parts.
which is totally the way to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. What this is interesting. That's not relevant to me. That's interesting. This doesn't apply, but it could. And then they rebuild a new car in their own life. Like, this is how most people read it. This is how I read it. This is sort of how I write it. And so I'm a believer in that. It's like, trust the audience. The audience is smart. Like the audience knows this thing you said, I can't do. They know that, right? And they will adjust to it or what have you. So it's interesting. And I do often argue as well that it's easy to think about the thing you care about and be like, I'm offended that you didn't mention that. But then you have to keep in mind, there's 20 other things that 20 other people care about that you don't. And if I mentioned those other 19, you would be kind of bored and skimming through it. So sometimes it's easiest just to say, let's just get to the core advice. It's an interesting question. Though then what I realized, not to get too much of the content creation on this, and we can change subjects soon. An interesting effect, though, is that if you look at the complaints about this, 9 times out of 10, the complaint is not me as the reader am offended that you're not recognizing this about my reality. It's them preemptively getting upset on behalf of someone else. What if someone else in this situation wasn't able to take in so that's like that piece gets into it as well. I obviously know. I know how to strip down your advice and I apply this or don't apply this. But what if someone else over here can't figure it out? Yeah. Which is a different type of thing, I think.
Yeah, I think that also this could just get to like the kind of content a person is making with some of the mental health stuff, because it is so profoundly individual. I would say that, the significant majority of the criticisms that we've gotten have been some version of, hey, I felt like my experience was not recognized. But again, that's because they're spending 100% of their life in between their ears, and I'm just trying to intuit what's in there. So, just like the individuality and the specificity of it just like feels so lived for people.
And I'll say what helped, like with my podcast, I take questions. And this has been fantastic because each of these questions is just like a unique person with a unique situation. And so now you begin running the advice against very specific circumstances.
Absolutely.
And even if it's not your circumstance that comes up, somehow it just, the tone is different. You're seeing, it's like an acknowledgement that people have very specific circumstances, and you get a practice. What does it look like to take this abstract concept and shape it to something specific? And if you see that happen a bunch of times, even if it's not your circumstance, you're like, oh, I get how this type of shaping works. And like, okay, now I feel better about. So I think that's been great about the podcast with my relationship with the audience, is that I'm just dealing with real people. And you're right, everyone is different in very interesting ways. And it's been good and humbling for me as well.
Yeah, we started doing a mailbag episode somewhat regularly about a year and a half ago or something like that. And it would be so easy for that to be just kind of like filler content. But it really hasn't been. It's been this great source of both inspiration in terms of like a lot of the episodes we end up doing these days essentially start as a question that somebody sent in. And it jogs something inside of my brain, and I go, oh, yeah, we should create some content related to that larger
Yep.
topic that they're speaking to. And so it's just been like a very positively self-reinforcing thing. As we get to the end here, I do want to ask you about one other thing, which is that I have a coaching practice. And so I work with people individually, and a good chunk of them are navigating some kind of life transition. Some of them are kind of later in life. They're trying to figure out how to slow down, find a new sense of purpose and meaning. Maybe the kids have left the house, whatever's going on. A lot of them, though, are more kind of late 20s. They're looking at a career transition of some kind, or they're looking for more meaningful work. And what I found when I talk to people is that there's often a lot of preoccupation with trying to figure out what they really want, or something that they're really inspired by, or something that they'll really connect to, something that feels meaningful for them. And this connects to, I think, one of the big ideas that sort of put you on the map, which comes from So Good They Can't Ignore You, where you talked about how following your passion is not necessarily the best advice for people. And I thought that it made sense for us to just kind of spend a minute talking about that, because for starters, I think that it's so interesting how you frame it. And also just very useful for some mental health stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's a concept that's newer than you think, first of all. Like, so when I was
follow your passion. Yeah.
follow your passion
Yeah.
it's when I was studying it for that book, what I discovered is like that phrase, follow your passion, that's a construction of the early 1990s. It really started to pick up steam a little bit later in the 1990s. It feels like timeless career advice, but actually it came out of the baby boomers trying to figure out, as their kids were advancing through the educational process. So in the 1990s is when the oldest baby boomers kids were going through middle school and high school and on to college, right? The baby boomers were trying to figure out, what advice do I give to my kids? And the baby boomers were balancing two different experiences from their own upbringing. So they had the sort of countercultural period of the 1960s, the radically reinvent your life, follow your bliss, leave the world of the workforce, go live on the commune or whatever. It was very idealistic, but largely kind of failed, right? And then they had the second piece of their life. It failed in the sense of most people from the baby boom generation came back
They did
from
not
the
end up
farm or
doing
the commune.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, but the ideals stayed there. Then they had, as they approached middle age, the big economic boom of the 80s, right? Where they were just making lots of money and buying nice houses. And it was almost like too capitalistic, right? This was Gordon Gekko, greed is good, right? And so they were trying to figure out, how do I balance these two things in my advice to my kids? And they were saying like, well, money is good. Like you need your work matters, and you need to pay a mortgage. And look, we have this like these nice houses,
society,
and cars,
et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
But but it's also, ideals are important, and blatant capitalism, like this wasn't great
Not
in the
so good,
1980s,
yeah.
right? So
Totally.
what if we made your work, like work's important, but also you make your work your source of like your idealistic self-fulfillment? That's where follow your passion.
What if we could
came
just
from.
check all the boxes? Yeah.
Yeah, we'll do it. You can have a nice house, but also like have idealistic fulfillment, right? If you can, so that's where follow your passion came from. It's bad advice because we don't have good evidence that most people are hardwired for a particular professional pursuit that, if followed, gives them sustainable, positive psychological affect. Like that's a clear hypothesis. Matching your work to an innate preference is a core source of meaning and fulfillment. We don't have evidence that's true. We do have a lot of evidence about factors of work that makes people motivated and feel better and be happy. They tend to be agnostic to the content of work. It's things like autonomy. It's things like a sense of mastery. It's things like a sense of connection to other people. These are not specific to a particular content of your career. Like I need to be in sports marketing, or I'm meant to be a nurse or whatever. So it led me to this idea that no, you're not trying to discover what you are meant to do. You're trying to create a livelihood that can support meaning and passion sustainability. And you have a lot of ways of doing that. So when you lower the bar from find your one true passion to be careful about constructing a life that's meaningful, the pressure is much reduced. When you
Yeah.
don't have to worry about, is this job the right one? And if it is, I'll be happy right away. And if it's not, I'll be miserable forever. And instead, am I doing the ongoing hard work of crafting an intentional, meaningful, deep life? And work is a big part of that, but not in the way of a true match, just like as I change my job and as I think about how I work. Anyways, that's what I've been preaching to people is you're working backwards from your vision of a life well lived, not working forwards towards some dream job that's going to change everything.
The target is wanting to end up feeling good about whatever it is that you're doing. But
Yeah.
there are probably a suite of things, 5 to 10 things, 20
Yeah.
things, depending on who you are, that you could reasonably become passionate about. It's kind of
Yes.
a behavioral activation thing, actually, where like we tend to get passionate about the stuff that we're good at, just broadly speaking. There are some exceptions, but generally that's the case. Or the stuff that we
Yeah.
do a lot, we tend to develop an interest in. And so thinking about it kind of that way, as opposed to I'm going to start with like finding my one true love, whether that's professionally or personally, follow your passion or like looking for the one is awful dating advice if there's only truly one person out there that you could ever make a good relationship with.
Yeah, because then you see every flaw.
Yes,
Otherwise, you see every flaw
absolutely.
as evidence that this
Yeah.
is not the one, which is what happens with the jobs. You see, like jobs are hard, right? Especially early on. And then you begin to interpret that as like, this is not my passion. I actually got onto this topic giving advice to college students about their majors, right? Because what was happening was, because I used to write books for college students, they would come to me later in their college career and say, I have to change my major. And I'd be like, look, you're halfway through your junior year. Like, this is kind of disastrous from a logistical standpoint. Why would you want to change your major so late in the game? What was happening? Upper class courses are harder. Like as you move up the courses required for a major, you get to these like really advanced courses later on. Hard courses aren't as fun. They had a mindset of you're wired to do one thing. So they were interpreting the difficulty of the course. That's not fun as meaning, well, this must not be what I'm meant to study because I'm not enjoying
Mm,
it moment to moment. So like what does matter for your job? Well, we know, autonomy matters, mastery matters, a sense that what you're doing matters, relationships matter. And we often miss this, being able to sidestep the things that specifically make you unhappy. Like I individually really don't like having lots of meetings. So if you can take that out of your work, that's going to make a big difference. So it's the things that in general make jobs good, but also avoiding the things that make, for you in particular, you really don't like. So how do you do that? How do you craft a job that way? This is the whole point of the book. You get good at things that are valuable and you use that as leverage and you shape your job. So
mm.
you go in a direction where you say like, I think this is an important direction. This work matters. And you get really good. And as you get really good, you can demand more autonomy. You're going to feel more mastery. You're going to have leverage because you're valuable in the marketplace. And you can use that leverage to reshape your job to get rid of the stuff you don't like. That's the formula for being passionate about your job. And you're absolutely right. Passion follows effort. It's not the precondition.
Maybe this is a good thing to end with here, Cal. One of the things that I was really curious about, and I think it connects to what you're talking about, because you said just there's some version of get really good at this thing, and then being a person who's really good at this thing, you can shape your work environment more. You can have more autonomy. You can demand up to people. Say, hey, I'm just not going to take that meeting because I'm a high performer and I need to perform more. I need to do my real work.
Yeah.
That kind of connects to in slow productivity the third maxim, which is obsess over quality. The word obsess in mental health world is a very complicated word. So I'm wondering what healthy obsession looks like to you.
Oh, I learned this. Yes, because
Yeah.
I got this feedback. It's interesting, right? Like
It's a
what the right,
complicated word. Yeah, totally.
and I thought about alternatives.
Yeah.
And I don't know if any of them quite worked. You could say prioritize, but
Hmm.
that's too loose. Like a lot of
Yeah.
people
Too light.
say, I prioritize whatever, but not really, right? So like with obsess, I guess what I meant to say was make this like a preoccupation, make this like a thing you care about with respect to your work
Yeah.
more than almost anything else.
Hmm.
Make it something that you get uncomfortable not having in your life. And so now you start walking a fine line because obsession can get disordered, right? And one of like the clear disorders of an obsession with quality is perfectionism. And I just say in the book, this is a very difficult line to walk. You have to walk the line of damaging perfectionism on this side and the slow productivity, life controlling jet fuel for meaning and passion, obsession about quality on this side. And it's a narrow line. It's easy to fall off on. And here's examples of people who did. And here's like my best advice for how to try to avoid this. You need to, set shipping deadlines. You need to focus on process over the results. There's all these things you can do, but it's difficult. And maybe that's why I used the word obsession, is that like I wanted to point out slow productivity at its like most high activity, going all cylinders, like really constructing this really notable life, requires that you walk that line on obsession. It doesn't require that just to use the principles. I think the principles of slow productivity can work in a much more moderated way. Like I could say it like, reduce the number of concurrent things you work on, have variation in your pace, make sure that you care a lot about quality. That's going to make your working life much better, right? But if you want to like achieve the cover image of the book where there's the cabin up on the hill in the woods and you're like, then it's, really work on a small number of things, have huge variation in your pace, and obsess over quality. So I was trying to capture people's attention with it.
This is probably obvious just in how I'm talking about it, but this was not something that I looked at as like, ooh, that's a red line. You shouldn't use that word. I just thought it was an interesting word choice from somebody who is, very thoughtful about this clearly. And I'm not surprised that you went through a process of kind of grappling with it a little bit.
Yeah, but what's surprising about this whole topic, and I was trying to react to this a little bit with the book, is that people really do need to be reminded about quality, which you would think abstractly, like, why would we have to remind someone to do good stuff? Like these jobs are they're creation jobs. You're creating value with like your brain, but pseudo productivity completely takes that out of the picture. Like when you are surrounded by pseudo productivity as your main motivational framework, nothing about pseudo productivity specifies quality. It's activity that matters. So it's almost like you have to relearn the otherwise obvious idea that the quality of what you produce ultimately is what matters. And it feels obvious, but for a lot of people, it's a major mindset shift.
I also think that we're so swamped with stuff, particularly on the content side these days, that it's easy to develop the kind of nihilistic worldview of, well, I'm creating one piece of whatever, and I see this endless flood of pieces of whatever coming at me. Isn't a better strategy to just churn out as much as I can and try to kind of like compete with that flood? Whereas it feels like you're taking sort of an alternative approach, and you illustrate a bunch of examples historically in the book of people who took a very alternative approach of really finding the things that they could do particularly well. They had a unique advantage around doing them. They were a particularly great writer. They were particularly good at this kind of thinking that we can apply to certain sorts of problems to create really great stuff. And then you let the greatness of the stuff be the measuring stick, be the thing that you're bringing in and also, frankly, feeling really good about. I find that just feels a lot better to create a good thing than to create 5 things that I don't really care for.
To me, this was natural because of my idiosyncratic career path, right? Because I'm a professor, right? And so when I was training to be a professor, so now I'm sort of done with promotions, I'm tenured, I'm a full professor, but the way it works in research institutions is in terms of getting tenure. So think of it as like keeping your job or getting fired, right? You become a professor, you have 5 to 7 years. At the end of that 5 to 7 years, you're fired unless you can go up in front of a tenure board and convince them that you're worthy of keeping on. The only thing, or I would say the primary thing that matters in that decision is peer-reviewed publications.
Yeah, research.
Like nothing else matters in that decision, right? All that matters is these papers you published, and that is a world that's all quality-based. It's very difficult to publish papers in good venues. It's very competitive. So like in computer science, we tend to publish in these peer-reviewed conference proceedings. And the way it works is if it's a good conference, they're going to accept about 20%, the best 20% of what's submitted. So you have all of these things being submitted by really smart professors from all around the world. And if you're not in the top 20%, like really did something good, your paper doesn't get in. And if you don't get enough papers in, you don't get to keep your job. So it's very purifying. To be as busy as you want.
That's the crucible right there.
It was like, send as many emails as you want, have as many meetings as you want, work on your social media marketing. That's all great. When it comes time to promotion, we look at your publication record, we send it to people who are prominent in your field and say, how important is this work? How impressive is this collection of work? And that's all that matters. So I had sort of been ingrained with this idea.
Yeah.
It's like quality is what matters. Everything else kind of gets in the way of it, or it's just orthogonal. It's stuff you have to do, but it's not important in the sense of it helps your career. It's just you being, it's just the administrative work that needs to be done. But I had been raised with this idea that ultimately, like, doing really good things, that's what matters. That's what gives you like a cool job, like I have now, being tenured and a full professor. But it's pretty scary along the way because you can't hide it. If it's not good, it doesn't get accepted. But more jobs, I think, can take on that mindset, right? If what you're good at is pseudo productivity, here's the problem. That's super replicatable. Like, it's not hard to answer emails. It's not hard to small talk on Zoom meetings. It's not hard to check in with vendors and see how things are doing. So if mainly what you're doing, it's not hard to do lightweight social media marketing, right? So if like that's mainly what you're doing, why can't like the next 23-year-old with nothing else going on come along and just take the job? Like, what are you doing? Sure. You have some institutional knowledge, but that's easily trained. So let's get another way to think about it is, what are you doing that's hard to replicate? And I think I had that rule. This might have been in Deep Work, or it might have been in So Good They Can't Ignore You, where I said, for the activity you're working on, ask yourself, how long would it take to train a 23-year-old to do what I'm doing right now? And if the answer is, give me a day and they could be doing this on my behalf, you're not working on things that's going to give you leverage that's ultimately going to help you advance.
Yeah, you're not in a very secure position for sure.
Yeah.
What are you thinking about these days, Cal? Like, what's your next project if you've got one in the books?
It's not productivity. I actually had agreed years ago with my publisher to write a book called The Deep Life. This is like the main organizing theme of my podcast.
Yeah.
That all of the specific stuff I talk about feeds. How do you build an intentional life that you're proud of living? And that's the theme of my podcast. And I'm finally combining all these ideas into a book that just tackles that. Like, how do you do it? The key thing about the way I'm thinking about this book is it's not about the what. So it's not about what should you have in a deep life, like what's important. I'm not qualified to answer that. It's about the how. Yeah. How does one go about successfully transforming their life in a radical way? The mechanics of life transformation. So that's what I've been thinking about now. So it's not productivity, it's not technology, it's not phones, it's not AI. I mean, I'm writing about that stuff as well, but the book I'm working on has been fun. It's about how does one get themselves into a position, practice, train, that they're ready to change their lives, and then what are the best practices for figuring out what to do and making those changes actually stick.
Totally connects to everything that we talk about, which selfishly I love. And I really appreciate you taking the time to do this today, Cal. This has been so great. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
No, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
I love talking today with Cal Newport, the author of Slow Productivity and many other books, including Deep Work, Rules for Focused Success in a Distracted World. That's the first book of his that I read. It had a big impact on how I do my work. And we started by talking about Cal's approach to productivity and how what he's really doing here is trying to redefine how we think about productivity, particularly for people who do knowledge work. Knowledge work is any kind of work where a person is mostly applying cognitive skills like thinking and creating rather than applying physical labor. And inside of those fields, productivity tends to be really poorly defined. If you are producing automobiles, you can just look at how many automobiles you made at the end of the year and say, hey, that's our marker of productivity. If you're a worker on the assembly line, you can look at how many widgets you screwed in as your key marker of productivity. But when you're doing something like organizing a team or managing a project or writing a book, it's a little bit harder to find these key markers because sure, you can write a chapter, but the chapter that you're writing might be quite different from the chapter that somebody else is writing. So the number of words that you write here may or may not be a good marker of productivity. This is all made way more complicated by a whole bunch of stuff that we talked about in the first 20 to 30 minutes of the podcast conversation. I love that part of the conversation. I find this stuff really interesting. And during it, we talked about the broader context of the work that Cal is doing here, how knowledge worker work changed dramatically with the technological revolution, and how particularly the advent of things like email, which allowed us to have a measure of busyness or a perceived measure of busyness, really transformed how people do work. And now that we have this thing that seems to indicate that a person is busy, they're sending a lot of emails, but has very little correlation, as near as we can tell, with actually accomplishing much, it's very easy to see how we could slide into this sort of permanent busyness without necessarily this big sense of accomplishment at the end of the rainbow. And that's where slow productivity comes in. And the three key ideas from slow productivity, they are very simple, but they carry a lot of impact if you're able to actually follow them. Do fewer things, work at a natural pace, and obsess over quality. Toward the end of the conversation, we talked a little bit about the word obsess. I thought that Cal's insight into it was really interesting, how he talked about his own journey with trying to find the right word there, knowing that obsess can be a bit of a complicated word, particularly in more of a mental health context. The word obsess can be a little complicated. And the notion of obsession broadly and obsessing over quality can tie into some more maladaptive behavior that people have. For example, as Cal said, more perfectionistic tendencies. But at the same time, chronic busyness really moved us away from focusing on what actually matters in our work, which, hey, end of the day, is the quality of our output. Additionally, improving the quality of what we're able to produce has all of these positive knock on effects for us. For starters, it feels really good. It feels really good to feel like you're doing good work. And it can also give us more freedom. When people know that we are a quality producer, that we do good work, all of a sudden we get to ask for more stuff. We get to design our work life with a lot more autonomy. We spent a lot of time during the conversation talking about the idea of doing fewer things, which connects to Cal's book, Deep Work. It also connects to the broader anti-productivity movement that has been having a real moment in the last 5 to 10 years or so. We talked, for example, about Oliver Burkeman and his book 4,000 Weeks, which had a major impact on me. And Cal, as somebody who has an engineering mindset, a sort of systems-based thinking, we talked a bit toward the end of the conversation about how when you are producing content for a broad group of people, you're focused on generalization. You're not really thinking so much about the individual context of every single person inside of it. And he cares about productivity, he cares about doing good work, he cares about being effective in the world. These are things that matter to him. It's pretty easy for people who have a social critique of productivity as, closely tied to the capitalist enterprise and the exploitation of labor and all of these things that, to be open about it, and you probably are already aware of this if you listen to the podcast regularly, I am very sympathetic to most of those ideas, if not all of them. It would be pretty easy for somebody who comes from that perspective to just lump Cal in with other people who produce productivity content, particularly people who come from that kind of grind set mindset, just do all the things you have to do in a day, the kind of getting things done approach that has come under significant fire in the last 10 or so years. But I really appreciated how Cal talked about things during this conversation. And I'm glad that we were able to spend some time talking about some of those critiques of his work or critiques of productivity culture in general. And I thought that his answers were extremely well thought out. They were very measured. They were very balanced. And he really focused again and again, not so much on doing more things, but on doing things that matter, doing the things that you find fulfilling. Appreciating that, frankly, the notion of like, oh, just don't engage in the capitalist enterprise or whatever is actually a very privileged perspective. There are not that many people around who can take a step back from capitalism and engage with society in a meaningful way and get their needs met by things like being able to pay the bills still. And what I love about his work is that he's really approaching the question of productivity from the perspective of how can we do stuff, whatever the doing stuff is that you're trying to do, raising kids, having a job, having good engagement with your hobbies, supporting your relationship, whatever it is. How can we do that in a way that's more human? How can we do that in a way that supports us as individuals, that's more in line with how our ancient ancestors did things? This is why he has a long section in the book focused on working at a natural pace. Like, what does that actually look like for people? How can we do all of this in a way that is much less exploitative while also supporting us and doing more of the things that we really care about, producing work that is of a kind and a quality that we can really feel good about, that we can really enjoy, that we can get some fulfillment out of? Then from there, we talked about a million different tools that you can apply to get more from your life, to take back control of your time and to make more of the things that you really care about. And most of these tools are things that you can apply whether you are a self-employed person or you work in a broader corporate context. Of course, it's always going to be easier to do this stuff when you have a lot of control over your time, but there are aspects of most of these ideas that I think that most people can really apply. Few examples here. So when we were talking about deep work, we talked about clarifying the deep work to not deep work ratio, which took us into a conversation where Cal really specified that it's not that deep work is better than not deep work. It's that these are two different styles of doing stuff. And for most people, they got to do some of both. So the question is, how much should we be doing of each of these two different categories? That's a conversation that if you have a boss or a supervisor, you can talk about with them. You can say something like, hey, last week I tracked it. I did 2 hours of deep work and I did 42 hours of not deep work. And that ratio is probably not where we want it to be. So what can we do system-wise to support me in doing more deep work? Then I talked about some of the things that I've implemented from Cal's work that have really helped me out. That's scheduling deep work time. Time blocking has been a huge thing I've started doing that has been very, very high impact for me. He also talked about multi-scale planning, something big idea of his that I've really loved. Planning your time on a quarterly, weekly, and then daily level so that the weekly flows from the quarterly, the daily flows from the weekly, and you're trying to eliminate the feeling of what should I be doing next. For me personally, this really helped me with work anxiety. And we spent actually a lot of time during the conversation, which I really appreciated, talking about the more psychological side of all of this and how that chronic busyness can really be an anxiety coping mechanism for people. Chronically checking your email, chronically checking your phone. These could be different soothing mechanisms that we have to deal with different kinds of anxiety. So a great lever here is how can we lower overall anxiety? And a good way to do that is by feeling like we have more control over our time. When we schedule our time, we take some of that control back. Toward the end of the conversation, we talked about how following your passion is not always great advice when you're trying to figure out what you want to do, particularly from a career standpoint, although I think there are a lot of implications in this advice for things like our personal life, our relationships, all of that stuff. And what Cal found when he looked at the idea of follow your passion is that this was actually a very new idea in our broader cultural consciousness. It feels like it's advice that just makes sense or it's kind of intuitive, but it really just came along in the 90s. And there's also a huge survivorship bias piece to this that we didn't really talk about during the conversation, and I wish I had kind of mentioned, that the people giving this advice are by and large famous people who did not themselves follow their passion. They stumbled into something. They found out that they were good enough at it, and it became a passion of theirs over time. Fixating on the idea that there is one thing that we can be passionate about and we need to find and follow that passion is just not true. It's just not the way that our minds work. And for most people, there are probably 10 to 20 things, if not even more than that, that they could plausibly become passionate about with a little bit of effort. I particularly liked how Cal emphasized that what tends to really bother people about their work environments is not so much whether or not they're following their passion or not, it's the real pain points that are associated with their work. So it's probably more effective for most people to write down a list of the 3 to 5 things that they really don't want to be doing as part of their work and avoid those 3 to 5 things than it is for them to search for the 1 or 2 things that they think that they could be passionate about. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Cal. I got a lot out of this one personally, and it was a style of conversation that we don't always have on the podcast where we're more focused on psychological or mental health topics. I tend to steer away from more productivity-based content for a bunch of reasons, some of which we talked about during today's episode. But I've always found Cal's work to be a really great example of this kind of thing. And I just appreciate his overall perspective on stuff and the humanity with which he treats these topics. So again, the book is Slow Productivity, The Lost Art of Accomplishment Without Burnout. If you like being well, you'll probably also enjoy Cal's podcast, Deep Questions with Cal Newport. And if you're watching us right now on YouTube, know that Cal also has a very successful YouTube channel. If you've made it this far without subscribing to the podcast, please subscribe to it. It really helps us out. Telling a friend about the podcast is probably the best way that we have to reach new people, and everyone knows someone who could benefit from learning about this stuff. If you'd like to support the podcast in other ways, you can find us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/beingwellpodcast, and for the cost of just a couple of dollars a month, you can support the show and get a bunch of bonuses in return, like transcripts of all of the episodes. Until next time, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.